Alrighty, everybody, welcome in. My name is Joe, and today we're going to talk King's Indian Defense. It's something we've hinted at before when we were talking about how to start playing chess when you're faced with the black pieces. We have some variations that we can do when our opponent leads off with openings that we know, like an e-pawn or a king pawn push when they lead off with e4. We've talked about just leading off with e5, going into like a mirror variation, which ends up into like an Italian game or a Ruy Lopez. But then we also have this generic setup that we can use for almost anything called the King's Indian Defense, where if our opponent plays almost anything else, we lead off with the knight. Whatever they play, we're going to push a g-pawn, get ready to fianchetto our dark square bishop. The one trick we had to remember in that video was what happens if they play their king's pawn at any point in time. And the idea here is we just push our king's pawn breaker. We just have to remember that little trick and stop this pawn from infiltrating. But the idea here is simple. We're going to fianchetto whatever our opponent does. We're going to fianchetto, get castled. We have this really solid structure, and then we kind of stopped and said, look, that's good enough, right? That's good enough to at least get us started as a beginner. We can go from here. We have development plans. We'll do something and get the rest of our pieces developed one way or another. But we really didn't dive into it because we didn't need to. We just want to memorize this small pattern with this one little trick so that we could start playing with purpose. And like we talked about, rule number one is just go play chess. And so I've been playing chess, and I've had a few games where I've gotten to play this very cool setup. And then I get to this point and I go, okay, I don't really know what I'm supposed to do right here, but I'm just going to follow my standard principles and just play good chess. And that's taught me some interesting things. At the games that I play, I'm facing people who know how to play against this, and so they're starting to push back on me, and I don't know theory. So I said, all right, how do I learn theory? What's the next step? And so this is set up so that you guys can learn along with me as we learn the King's Indian Defense specifically, where we've got videos on the Italian game, we got videos on the Ruy Lopez, the Queen's Gambit, the Catalan, the Ready. We've got these named openings that we've been throwing around, right? So now it's time to look at the King's Indian as a named opening and look into what are their strategies, what are the plans, what are the things that we should be looking for, and how do we gain that knowledge? Named openings, we use these names to describe move orders that the experts have shown us the path, right? The experts, the smart guys out there have played these games, thousands of games, and they've studied them, and they've looked at the positions that result in, they've looked at what's the best from both sides of the board, and they've made kind of some game plans for us that we can now, pick off the vine and use for our own purposes. One of the most famous players that played a lot of the King's Indian was Garry Kasparov, who's considered one of the all-time greats, world champion, people have studied his games. He himself has written multiple books. He's a fantastic teacher, and a lot of people have learned from him. And he had played this King's Indian Defense many times. So this is a very strong opening that even us as beginners, we can learn from it, and we can develop our own kind of game plan. So from here, the idea is we're going to talk a little bit about what the main strategies of the King's Indian Defense, and we're going to talk about how to play against some variations that we might see, but really we're just talking about what are the themes, and as long as we know the themes, that we can kind of push those pieces to support those themes and play good chess, all right? So the first thing that I learned when I started playing this is I got to this position and I said, now what? Well, looking at what the experts have done, the main themes are going to be the e5 pawn push and the f5 pawn push to break open the center. So black's game plan from the King's Indian Defense is to break open the center, or if the center closes down, attack the wings, including a king side attack. So the King's Indian Defense can become a king side attack, which is kind of fun, especially us as beginners, to put, if we're using the black pieces and we end up in a position where we feel like, oh no, we have to be defending, we can flip the table and we can really put the pressure on our opponent to have to defend. And so the King's Indian Defense gives us that flexibility. There is a lot of, I have learned a lot of theory on the King's Indian Defense. We do not have to memorize all of that. We're just going to learn the main themes at this point in time. So the main themes are going to be an e5 pawn push supporting an f5 pawn push to break open the center. Now what that means is that our knight that we developed is doing a good job right now, but we're eventually going to remaneuver it out of the way. It might come right back, and that's okay. It might jump up here and become an attacking piece. One of the other themes is this other knight eventually rotates all the way around and joins in that attack. We'll see it rotate around in different ways to become a really strong attacking piece. Sometimes this knight, so there are times when we have to shift our mindset away from the king side and attack the queen side, and in that case this knight can end up on c5. So we can rotate that knight and rotate it on c5, because again, what we're going to do is we're going to bust open this center. We're going to bust open this center, and when we do, the center pawn is no longer here, and so our central pawns are going to be defending our knight, and that knight can become a really strong outpost. So themes: bust open the center, rotate this knight out of the way, maybe rotate it back, maybe continue the attack. This knight is going to come all the way over and join the party. Or if things get jammed up and this knight's not going to make it all the way over, look at parking it here on c5. And the last thing that we need to be aware of is as things get jammed up for white, white's going to end up pushing this central pawn to sort of lock down the board, right? That's one of the things that gives us access to this nice defended square. The light square bishop for white gets blocked in, and so this becomes a weaker bishop, but this one is a strong bishop. Now our dark square bishop is on this beautiful long diagonal. White is going to use their bishop to try to get rid of our bishop, and so one of the other themes is attack this bishop, see if we can remove this bishop, exchange this bishop, maybe with this knight or this knight. Maybe we just push it with a pawn, get rid of it. Maybe we try to shove it back somewhere. But white is going to be using their dark square bishop to counteract our dark square bishop. So if we can remove it, that's a good thing for us. So King's Indian defense, main themes: bust open the center with the E and F pawns, remaneuver your knight to give it a good attacking chance. Don't be afraid of a king side attack. Your other knight is going to reroute into the game, and again, if we're busting open the center, that pawn is not going to be there, so this knight will end up happily living maybe on f5 after all. If the center clogs up and we need to shift things a little bit to the queen side to help in our busting open of the center, we can reroute this knight. I've even seen cases where this knight rerouted all the way to the rim before coming in. And we can keep that in mind, that, you know what, maybe we need to shift this knight around because we want to defend our central pawns while busting open the center. So maybe we stick the knight here on a6 to defend temporarily before we shift it to c5. Because remember, that knight is going to c5. That's a theme if the center gets locked up. And then remove the dark square bishop, because that's really the only good bishop that white's going to have, because the light squares are going to be locked down. So those are our themes. And I learned this just by going out and doing searches. King's Indian defense, King's Indian main themes, who plays King's Indian defense, and watching videos and reading, articles and books and things on the King's Indian defense just to see what those strategies are. Now, before we talk specifics about games, let's look at, I'm going to take you to another website called openingtree.com. OpeningTree is a database of databases. The idea is it shows us what players have played in certain positions. And I mentioned Garry Kasparov, who was a world champion, is considered one of the all-time greats, still active today. He retired from classical chess, but he pops up in some online tournaments from time to time. The man's obviously good at what he does, and he's written several books, and he's taught, dozens of other grandmasters. The guy's good. So we're looking at his games, and I popped up Opening Tree, and I found Garry Kasparov in the list. And Garry, most of the games that this is loaded are older classical games that got loaded into the database. So he doesn't have as many modern games. We'll look at someone who does have more, online games that we can mine the database for. But if we analyze his games, and we go to the move list, that was already analyzed. I shouldn't have clicked it again. We go to the move list. What we're looking for is, so what does white move? Well, we want to see what happens when someone plays d4 against Garry Kasparov. These are Garry Kasparov's games, what his most common response to d4 is. And you can see when we look at this list, it's growing and it'll continue to grow, and it'll get more and more lopsided that Garry plays the King's Indian Defense. So Kasparov will play knight f6, and then you can see the most common moves from there. And just going through a standard game, what it would look like, the most common moves. And you can see Garry plays the g6, so he's getting ready for that fianchetto. Knight c3, and he goes from here. There's two different moves that he plays. The d5 move, I had to look this up, because I know that when we play the King's Indian Defense, we'll push d6, not d5. Well, d5 is known as the Grunfeld defense. It is also a very strong defense, and you can end up in these some similar kinds of positions. But we're specifically looking at how does Kasparov play the King's Indian Defense. And so we move into the King's Indian Defense, and you can see the most common moves from this were e4. And well, we know what to do in e4, and you can see all of those games resulted in Garry playing that King's Pawn Breaker, right? d6. This is exactly what we've talked about. And now from here are the most common 1, 2, 3. These are the three most common moves. f3, knight f3, and bishop to e2. These are the three most common moves. And you'll see a lot of these bishop to e2, knight f3. You'll see a lot of them also transpose, so you'll get some variations back and forth. There are some other ones. f4, bishop to d3, h3. There's still a couple of games in here. And there's even one game where knight to e2 was played. But we don't really need to study every single game at our level, right? We're beginning, we're just learning, we're getting better, right? We're moving past being a beginner, and we're moving into that intermediate, medium level of play. So let's look at some theory. And so these are the kind of things that I looked up as, what does this mean? What does the f3 pawn push mean? What does this mean when knight comes to knight f3? What is, Kasparov castles? From here, well, a few people have played h3, this outside h pawn, probably looking to stop something like this. But by and large, it's bishop e2. So this is the kind of main setup. And doing our research, I discovered this is the classical variation, also known as the orthodox variation. You'll notice the theme of pushing f5, busting open the center. We're still in a massive amount of games here. Pushing f5, busting open the center, and getting ready to push f6, remaneuver the knight, remaneuver this knight. You'll see these themes develop. e5, white has a few responses that white can do. You'll see some castling. d5, closing the center, and there's even a few games where people capture. This bishop to e3 is just a standard developing move you'll see a lot. But the two main ones is castling. And from here you'll see that, okay, we're doing it. We are rotating our knight around. And if we follow that knight, let's see where that knight goes. Yep, sure enough, there's that theme of that knight rotating into the game. The center has closed, just like we talked about. This light square bishop is no longer as strong because it's butted up. Now, granted, these are games played at the highest level. These are, average rating 2,700, average rating 2,700, average rating 2,600. These are games played at the highest level of grandmaster games. And if these guys are doing this, then I can learn something from them. So the center is now closed. Kasparov has started to rotate his knight, getting ready to get it over here on the king's side. My guess is we'll probably see this knight rotate somewhere out of the way temporarily before we see an f5 push. And let's see if we see that in some of the games that he's played. Oh no, look, there's an early outside a pawn move. There we go. We're starting to reroute the knight. Oh, is he going to stick this knight up here? So another theme is, like you talked about, one of the knights sitting on c5 becomes an outpost. Well, one of the challenges to that outpost, the only thing that can challenge, and why it's called an outpost. It's called an outpost because the only thing that can dislodge it is either a high value piece, which in this case would be the dark square bishop, which we know is a high value piece in this setup, and there's no pawn there. Well, that pawn, we don't want that pawn there, so pushing this outside a pawn, well, look at that. Now, white cannot challenge the knight because we've already got some control on that square. So he is setting up an outpost using support from his outside pawn. And here's the key move, that f5 pawn push, which, look, as us beginners, one of the things we talked about was don't touch your f-pawn, right? The f-pawn is the forget about it pawn, and we said in some cases on the black side of the board, pushing the f-pawn is a little bit okay, whereas on the white side of the board, pushing the f-pawn can be deadly. The King's Indian Defense is obviously one of those games in which, or one of those setups where pushing the f-pawn from black is a good thing, and we can see that clearly. Now we think about it a little bit, we could say, well, the light square bishop is kind of bad. It's not getting here anytime soon, so opening up this diagonal is not quite as scary as it could be in other cases. For this bishop to get into the game, a lot of things would have to happen, and stuff is going to start getting traded off, so maybe it's not so bad. Okay. And we see Kasparov makes the pawn push, getting ready to bust open this pawn structure. And from here, we can continue to follow on. White is trying desperately to get this outpost away, keep that outpost away. And I'm just following some games. Wow, look at this knight rerouting all the way over. That was a theme we talked about, right? Rerouting the knight from the queen side all the way over. This knight is now walking all over the place. Now we're starting to get really deep into deep theory, which is beyond our level, but we can see the themes. The theme of, since this position closed down, building an outpost for the knight over here on c5, which you can see the fight happening here, and these are GM grandmasters who are playing at the highest level. They know better than I do. We saw the knight rotate all the way around over to the king side. This center's about to bust open, and all of a sudden we're going to get some strong positions where these knights who are doing a good job of holding down the board. You'll also notice that here we are way deep into this game, move 14-15, and black has not developed their light square bishop. That's a theme as well, is the light square bishop for us on the black side of the board is not a strong piece. It gets blocked off and it's hard to develop. I said this in my own game when I was playing. The few games that I played, I found this to be true as well, that I don't know what to do with the light square bishop. And I can take a little bit of, faith in the fact that Kasparov, one of the greats, also doesn't really find a good way to get this bishop involved early. So now we're looking deeper and deeper into the position. All right, so let's go all the way back. I don't want to get too deep into one specific Kasparov game, but we can go through and we can see that another variation, instead of this bishop e2, knight f3, is this f3 move. Now this is known as the same-ish variation. Right, so we're not in the classical anymore. The previous variation we looked at was the classical. Now we're in the same-ish variation. If the opponent, if white knows what black's theme is, and the theme is to eventually bust open the center with f5, well, this f3 move kind of shuts that down, doesn't it? Not really, and here's why. So the game plan for black is going to be basically the same thing, but since this is now overprotected, we're just going to shift a little. Instead of, we're still going to go e5 and f5, and we're still going to try to bust open the center, but we're going to include the queen side attack as well. So we're going to bring our pawns that were on the other side of the board, we're going to bring them into the fight as well. So while white is trying to defend their center and trying to strengthen their center, we are going to use both flanks and really punish and really start to control both flanks of the board, which is still going to end up supporting our kingside attack eventually, because white is now going to end up having to defend not only all of these overextended pawns, but they're going to have to shift pieces to the queen side as we start busting things open. Notice again that this c5 square is going to end up being a theme, because our knight can still sit there in the c5. We might even see a position where we push this c6 pawn, rotate our knight all the way out, and then bring it back in this way, because we want this knight to help control some of the queen side. So this is against this same-ish variation. And if we look at Kasparov's games real quick, we'll see, yep, looks like he just castles, normal position, an opponent develops. Oh, look at that, there's that telltale e5 break. Knight c6 is also on the cards. Oh, look, there's that c6 possibly that we were talking about, the pawn move. So you can see these same themes popping up, and now that we know what the themes are, we know how to apply them, you know, how to put them into practice in our games. Two main moves from here. We can see the knight getting developed, or we can see a closing down of the position. Let's look at what happens when they close down the position. There's the c6. And so the slight difference is now we're going to use our queenside pawns to help bust open this position, instead of just going directly into the kingside attack. Now you can see here, Kasparov also reroutes his knight and starts going for a queenside attack as well, so that's also on the cards. So we keep both of these in the back of our mind. The King's Indian defense is extremely flexible, and that's one of the nice things about it. And as beginners, it gives us a chance to kind of stick to a theme. We don't have to memorize specific moves, we just have to learn a few themes. Some basic strategies. All right, so let's look at, let's continue on this. We looked at what happened when they closed the center down. Now let's look what happens when when opponent continues developing. Hey, look, there's that c6 pawn move. Getting ready to bust open the center. Maybe even use the queenside b pawn. Will we see a b pawn attack? Let's take a look. Getting the knight rotated in. Our opponent's looking to maybe even castle kingside or queenside. That's interesting. Aha, look at that. Our opponent tries to close down the center, but our central themes of getting ready, we knew what we were about. Now we can get directly into the opponent's position. We can look at rerouting and busting open an even weaker center now. We've got a queenside attack going. So that's interesting that Kasparov is going for a full queenside attack. But again, now we're into deep, deep, deep theory, which is probably, g4. I don't know what this is. I'm not familiar at all. But you can see some of the pawn moves. But yep, there's that b5 move. So even though I don't understand exactly what Kasparov is doing in these exact positions, I don't quite know these deep, deep theories. I knew that, well, in the same-ish variation, when we see this same-ish variation, this f3 move, we know that we're going to have to look at our queen side pawns. And sure enough, we saw exactly that. Boom, boom, boom. The queen side pawns have now been activated, helping to bust open the center, helping to control some key squares. Okay, that's a theme that we can stick in the back of our mind. All right, let's go all the way back. Same-ish variation is what happens when we see the f3 pawn push. In the back of our mind, we know that these pawn moves are a good, but we're going to, in this case, we just continue developing. Oops, I can't do it that way. Got to do it this way. Continue developing. If our opponent makes a move, we always have our central theme of the e pawn break, the f pawn break, and attack on the king side. Central themes. We always have that, and you can see most of the games were played that way. There's a couple games here where he went with an early c6 and an early knight to c6 even. Notice this. Oh no, back up. Yeah, nobody pushed here. That's so funny to me that no games were played from this position. I guess that gives too much leeway for the knight to jump in. I'm curious about that. Yeah, it just gives way too much leeway. So the experts know what they're doing, man. But in this, we see more developing, and again, we got our queenside pawns ready to push the outside pawns. An interesting in-between move here, and then b5. There it is. Boom. So we know that theme. If we see the same-ish, we're going to get ready with our queenside pawns to keep them ready to go. We're still holding this in our back pocket. We are still holding the central theme of the e5, f5 pawn break. And here we're following as soon as I say that, here's a specific game, and boom, there's the e5 pawn push. Completely ignoring this because these guys are pros. They know what they're doing. It looks, my guess would be the knight can rotate out that way. No, he's going out. Wow, what a crazy game. Interesting. And then getting ready for this, maybe? No. Okay. Well, see, this is interesting. But again, we're in deep theory. We're not going to follow along with Kasparov's games. This is openingtree.com, and I want to encourage you guys to take a look at it. It's cool to kind of churn through some of the data. I'm getting lost in playing with it, but I don't want to get too lost. So let's go back to the very beginning. The King's Indian defense. As we're learning theory, we now know the main themes. The main themes are, oops, not e4. The main themes are develop with purpose. If our opponent plays at any point in time the king's pawn, we play the king's pawn breaker. Whatever our opponent plays from here, we are ready to get our fianchetto structure set up. Get our fianchetto structure, and then we are ready to castle. Excuse me. From here, e-pawn push, f-pawn push, ready to break apart the center. Maybe look at rotating our knight all the way around. Maybe look at sticking our knight on c5. We're always keeping one eye on that c5 square, that if the center gets completely closed down, do we want to park a knight on c5? If so, do we need to push an a-pawn to stop their opponent from pushing their b-pawn? Or do we just go back to a main theme of, you know what, let's just whose move? Let's just dive into the center. Let's just attack the center, right? Boom. If that happens, that's okay. Boom, boom. Our opponent develops. This looks like this might be a free pawn. It isn't, because we can grab the pawn back. So we've both grabbed a pawn now, and we've opened up a discovery on the opponent's knight. They have an attack, we have an attack. We could trade if we wanted. Notice now we've got pressure along this open diagonal. We have opened up this completely long diagonal, exactly what black wants to do. White has some threats. They really have to start looking at defending. We have control of the center. So this is good for both players. Both players are developing. Black has a little bit more it needs to develop. Black's king could hide here. White's dark square bishop is stuck defending until more moves happen. But this ends up being good for both players. And at the end of the day, if black ends up with a draw, that's still okay. We're playing from the black pieces, which traditionally, because white is dictating the pace of play, black is typically looking at defensive structures and trying to hold off an attack. If we end up with a nice position like this where we are controlling some really key squares, this is a positional advantage. Material on the board is dead equal. This is a positional advantage because black already has control of some real key areas and just has a little bit more develop to do, whereas white is got developing done but is not really controlling any of the key squares yet. All right. Backing up. So that's kind of the classical variation. Again, the theme of busting open. The center could get shut down. And we're like, you know what? I'd like to really get my other knight involved in the game somewhere. Want to start moving it over. Or we could immediately look at rotating our knight out of the way, temporarily sticking it on the edge. We're going to bring it back, or we're going to include it in a strong attack. And we're ready to push f5 and really bust open this position. And then the last theme was, yeah, see if we can remove this dark square knight, right? If we go all the way back, see if we can find ways to remove this dark square knight. if our opponent were to do, say, something like this, you know what? We're okay with that exchange. We would be happy with that exchange. Our opponent could even do something like, let's say they leave this alone and they develop here. And then we decide we're going to develop here. And they go something like this. And they look at exchanging off this particular bishop. We know that sometimes when we fianchetto, it's okay to move the rook out of the way, and then our opponent does something like this to attack. That's okay. We would like to keep our dark square bishop. We would like to keep that, but removing our opponent's dark square bishop is also a benefit. So again, we're not too scared of this. We're going to let our opponent capture, and so that way the queen never reaches here. Let's say we do something like getting ready for an attack here, and our opponent captures. We'll just step up here. Notice this is not going to happen, so we're safe. At this point in time, maybe something like this, something like this. Everything's defended. What else could happen? Maybe a rook in, putting pressure here. Well, then we can bust open the center here. You get the idea, right? I'm just making moves, but you get the idea because those themes are the same. All right, let's back up, back up, all the way to the beginning. So if our opponent plays something that we don't recognize, whatever it is, we can still do our King's Indian setup. And then we just remember what the themes are. The themes are gonna be bust open the center. Well, there's nothing in the center in this case, so we don't really have anything to bust open, but we're gonna get ready to bust it open when it does start happening. We've got our e5, our f5 are in the back pocket. Maybe we prepare it with d6, which d6 is a good move anyway because it defends against the king's pawn breaker. So maybe we get d6, that's a theme, right? So our themes are these. Our themes are, you know, I'd like to get this knight all the way around, so maybe I do that. Maybe let's see, it's white's turn to move. They push d4. Let's, maybe we're getting ready to get our knight rotated around. What's another common move here? And we're getting ready for our e5 pawn break. And we kind of transpose into something that looks like this. I'm just making moves. But now we've got our knight ready to come over to this side of the board, which is a theme, to get ready for both of our knights to basically have a crazy, crazy control right in front of the opponent's king. Right? Controlling all of this mess right in front of the opponent's king, which is really cool to do. So the theme of rotating our knight around. So if we don't know what to do, right? If there's no tactic on the board and we're just looking for strategies in the King's Indian defense, what's our strategies? Well, now we know. All right, guys, so we're gonna go out here and we're gonna start playing some games with the King's Indian defense now that we know a little bit of the theory, now that we know a little bit of the lines to look at, now that we know how to play these games, we're gonna go play some chess using this knowledge and we'll see how that develops for us. All right, guys, thanks so much.